Ute. If one night you heard a faint knock at the door, weak as the wind, and when you opened it, there stood a girl in torn clothes, blood streaked down her neck, her eyes hollow like someone half dead, what would you do? Slam the door shut? Or let the storm step into your life? The night had no mercy. Inside a smoke-filled saloon, dice rattled across the table one last time, and with them, a man's soul fell apart. Her father, drunk on whiskey and desperation, lost more than coin that night he lost his daughter. With a careless flick of the wrist, he signed away the only thing left of value, Evelyn. She was no bride. She was no choice. She was payment. The man who claimed her wore polished boots and carried land deeds in his pocket, the kind of man who thought wealth scrubbed away the rot inside. But the smile on his face wasn't pride, it was hunger. Hunger for control, hunger to break something pure and call it his. That night, under a roof meant to shelter, Evelyn became a ledger entry in another man's game. She didn't scream when the dress tore from her shoulder. Screams were wasted here. No one in that house would come. No one would stop him. His hands were fast, his grip practiced. She stood pinned to the wall, the weight of her father's sins pressing harder than the man himself. Each touch, each cruel laugh carved into her memory, a debt she never owed but was forced to pay. Something was stolen, something no law in town would ever name. She knew it would not end when the night did. She would carry that weight, in her body, in her blood. And the world outside? It would look away. Men like him always made sure of that. But what if the weight kept growing? What if inside her there lived not just memory, but consequence? How does a woman survive when her own body carries the mark of violence? The cards were played, the papers signed, the door locked. And Evelyn, silent as the grave, understood. There was no rescue coming. If freedom was to be found, it would not be given. It would have to be taken at the edge of dawn, with blood still wet on her skin. The night did not end. It bled into the dawn like a wound that refused to close. Evelyn's body ached from every bruise, but her spirit, though torn, refused to stay caged. The man had locked her in that bedroom as though she were livestock, a debt bound by four walls and a paper signed in whiskey-stained ink. He thought she would break quietly. He thought she would learn obedience. But something inside her would not bend. She waited until his snoring grew deep, the kind of sound a man makes when he believes the world already belongs to him. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, every step a gamble between life and death. She could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, each tick sounding like a gun cocked against her skull. The sheet was the only thing she had left to cover herself. She wrapped it around her body, pulled it tight, and pressed her palm against the wooden door. The latch clicked, the sound was louder than thunder in her ears. For a moment, she froze, her breath shallow, her heart pounding like a hammer in her chest. But the silence of the house gave her courage. She slipped into the hallway, the boards creaking beneath her weight. One wrong move, one wrong sound, and he would wake. If that happened, there would be no second chance. The front door loomed like salvation. She pushed it open and stepped into the chill of early dawn. The desert air cut sharp against her wounds. The sky was bruised purple, the horizon stained with the first thin line of sun. She did not stop to breathe it in. She ran, barefoot, across stone and cactus, through dust and thorn. Each step shredded her skin, but she didn't care. Blood ran down her ankles, mixing with the dirt. Behind her, the world of locked doors and signed papers shrank into nothing. Ahead, only silence and the endless desert. But silence can be dangerous too. Silence can hide eyes watching. By mid-morning, the sun was merciless. The sheet clung to her with sweat and dust, heavy like chains. Her legs trembled, her throat burned dry. Each time she stumbled, she heard his voice in her head, mocking, reminding her she was his. Each time she forced herself up, rage pushed her forward. She did not know where she was going. She only knew where she could not stay. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes it all blurred together. Her vision swam, the horizon bending in waves of heat. Then, just when her strength was about to shatter, she saw it. Smoke, thin and curling against the sky. A sign of life. A chance. She staggered toward it, each step slower, heavier. By the time she reached the wooden fence, her body gave out. She fell hard against the rancher's door. It was not a knock, more like a collapse. more like the sound of desperation landing against old wood. Inside, Jonas Kane had been sitting at his table, the kettle just set on the fire. He was a man used to silence, a man who had carried war in his bones and preferred the company of quiet. But that sound, the soft thud at his door, was not something he could ignore. He reached for the shotgun that hadn't left its hooks since 2076. With one hand on the stock, he pulled the door open. What he saw was not a burglar, not an enemy, not even a neighbor. It was a girl, barefoot, blood caked at her neck, wrapped in nothing but a filthy bedsheet. Her eyes met his eyes that had seen too much. Too young. Vacant, yet still burning. Like an animal cornered one too many times. Jonas didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply pulled his coat from the hook and held it out. She stared at it for a heartbeat. Unsure if it was a trap. Unsure if kindness was something she could still believe in. Then, her trembling hands took it. She wrapped it around herself and whispered, steady but broken, "I'm not clean." Jonas didn't flinch. He didn't nod. He simply gestured toward the tack room out back. A place with walls, a roof, and a door she could close. She walked as though her bones might give out any second. Jonas followed at a distance, not pressing, not prying. He heated the kettle again, poured her water, left bread on the table, and still he said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only mercy a man can give, but Jonas knew. He had seen that look before in saloons, in war camps, in the eyes of men broken by power. He knew this wasn't just a runaway girl. This was a wound left by someone who thought the rules belonged to him alone. He set the rifle by the door. Because trouble, Jonas knew, never comes alone. If a girl arrives at your doorstep looking like she's been hunted, it's only a matter of time before the hunters follow. And Jonas Kane? He had been waiting a long time for a fight worth having. Now, you tell me if it were you. Would you have opened that door? Would you have given her your coat or turned her away to face the desert alone? Because Jonas made his choice. And soon enough, the men she ran from would make theirs. And when they came riding down that trail, dust rising behind their hooves, the quiet ranch would no longer be quiet. If your heart's already racing, don't walk away now. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the past comes pounding at Jonas's door, and share this story with someone who still believes the West was built only by law. Out here, it's built by choices. And sometimes, the choice to protect a stranger is the most dangerous one of all. The fire in the tack room hissed softly, but Evelyn didn't sleep. She couldn't. Each time she closed her eyes, she was back inside that bedroom, pressed against the wall, the air stolen from her lungs. Each creak of the ranch house made her flinch. Every shadow across the window reminded her of hooves pounding closer. Yet, through the haze of fear, there was a strange new silence, different from the silence she had known. Not the silence of a locked room, but the silence of a man who gave her space to breathe. Jonas Kane wasn't a man of words. He'd learned long ago that words were easy to twist, easy to break. Action was the only language worth speaking. And now, his actions spoke louder than sermons. He had opened his door. He had given her his coat. He had offered shelter, without a single question, but questions still hung heavy in the air. When dawn rose higher, he stepped out to mend the front gate. Evelyn watched him from behind the tack room window. His frame was broad, his movement steady, deliberate. There was no cruelty in him, no sharpness in the way he hammered each nail. He was not like the others. Still, trust was not something she could hand out anymore. Trust had been stolen, bartered, betrayed. By midday, her legs carried her out onto the porch. Jonas was bent over the gate, sweat cutting lines down the dust on his skin. She stopped a few feet away, clutching the coat tighter around herself, her bare feet hesitant on the hard ground. "Can I help?" Her voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the wind. Jonas didn't look up right away. He lifted a small hammer and held it out. "You know how to swing one of these?" She shook her head. "Well, you're about to learn." The hammer felt heavy in her hand, heavier than its weight. She raised it, clumsy at first, but Jonas guided her without a word, just a nod, just the patience of someone who knew what it meant to start over. Each strike against the nail sent a shock up her arm, but also something else, a reminder that she wasn't powerless. For the first time in too long, she wasn't being used. She was building. The sun slid lower. They sat side by side beneath the porch roof. Evelyn's eyes traced the horizon, the line where earth met sky. You think he'll come back? Jonas leaned forward in his chair, his boots flat against the dirt. I'd bet my last boot on it. She nodded, not in fear, but in certainty. Deep down, she had known it all along, but her hands no longer trembled. Jonas had noticed that too. The peace did not last. Late afternoon, the dogs barked low, guttural, the kind of warning that stiffened the air. Jonas rose, every movement calm but deliberate, his hand brushing the stock of the rifle by the door. Evelyn froze where she sat. Dust was rising on the trail. A rider cut through the sunlight, hard and fast, the thunder of hooves echoing across the dry land. He pulled up at the fence, a scar etched deep across his cheek, pistol heavy on his hip. His eyes swept the yard before narrowing on Jonas. Lost something? Jonas asked, voice flat as iron. The rider didn't smile. Saw a girl come through here. Blonde, barefoot, might be wearing a sheet. She belongs to Mr. Glay. Papers signed. I'm just here to bring her home. Evelyn's breath caught sharp in her throat. Jonas didn't flinch. He filled a bucket at the well, letting the water splash loud into the wood. You see a girl running barefoot through cactus and rock, bleeding half to death. You don't bring her home. You bring her help. The rider's jaw tightened. She's his wife. Jonas turned slowly, locking eyes with him. She's a girl with bruises on bruises, and the man who put them there ought to be ashamed to call himself anything but a coward. The silence stretched thin, dangerous. You sure you want to stand between Mr. Glay and what's his? The rider asked, voice low, hand brushing the grip of his pistol. Jonas stepped forward, close enough for the distance to speak its own warning. I'm sure I ain't moving. The rider's hand lingered, then fell away. He smiled a cold, empty curve of the mouth. Next time, he won't be alone. With a tug on the reins, he turned his horse and rode back down the trail, dust curling behind him like smoke from a gun barrel. Jonas stood for a long moment, watching until the rider was gone. When he turned back, Evelyn was at the window, her eyes locked on him. She wasn't looking away this time. She was watching, measuring, trying to understand what kind of man she had landed in the hands of. Jonas set the bucket down, walked back inside, laid bread on the table by the door. She didn't touch it right away, but her eyes followed him, not with fear, but with something quieter. A question. That night, the desert was still. But Jonas knew better. Men like Glay didn't send one dog. They sent a pack. And next time, it wouldn't be a warning. Next time, it would be a storm. Jonas cleaned the old rifle that hadn't seen daylight in years. The sound of the metal, the click of the chamber, was its own kind of prayer. Not for blood, not for vengeance, but for resolve. Because once a man decides to stand, there's no halfway. Evelyn sat in the tack room, staring at the walls, clutching the coat tighter around her. Yet for the first time, she felt something strange slip into her chest. Not safety, safety was too far a word, but possibility. Out in the dark, Jonas Kane sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew they would come. He knew the fight wasn't finished. And he knew, when it did, he would not run. The day bled slow into evening, the kind of Arizona sundown where the sky burned red like a wound left open. Evelyn stood near the tack room window, her hands clutching the sill, eyes fixed on the horizon as though staring could hold back what was coming. She didn't need to ask if they would return. Jonas had already given her the answer. When the dogs growled low deep in their throats, not panicked but certain, Jonas rose from his chair on the porch. His movements were steady. No rush, no wasted motion. He picked up the rifle leaning against the wall, the same one he had cleaned the night before, and set it across his lap. His eyes, gray with years of war and dust, narrowed against the glare of the setting sun. They came as he knew they would. 3 riders, cutting through the dying light, hooves hammering like distant thunder. Dust curled high behind them, a storm, riding on leather saddles. At the front rode Glay, dressed too fine for a man with a soul so dirty. His gloves were white, his coat pressed, but his eyes were mean, sharp with ownership. On either side of him rode muscled 2 men built like stone walls, their hands heavy on pistols polished from use. They pulled up at the fence, horses stamping, breath steaming. The sound of metal buckles and leather creak filled the air. Jonas didn't move. He sat as though carved into the porch itself. Only his thumb brushed the rifle stock, slow, deliberate. Evening, Glay called, his voice dripping with the false sweetness of a man who believed the law was his leash to snap. Heard you've been keeping my wife. Jonas's reply was flat. Heard you've been beating what ain't yours to touch. The smile slid off Glay's face like mud in the rain. He dismounted, slow and careful, removing his gloves one finger at a time. Behind him, the two men shifted, one loosening his revolver, the other stepping heavy onto the dirt. That girl belongs to me, Glay said, voice rising. Paper signed, law on my side. Jonas stood then, calm as morning, the rifle cradled easy in his arms. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching in the dirt. Law don't mean a damn when a man's got no soul. You don't own her. You don't own nothing but the rot you carry. Ed, the first of Glay's men rushed forward, quick but clumsy, hoping speed would outmatch resolve. Jonas pivoted, the rifle stock cracking hard against the man's jaw. The sound split the air, bone against wood. The man dropped, blood spitting into the dust. The second drew iron. Faster? Sure, but not fast enough. Jonas's rifle thundered once, the echo slamming against the hills. The man staggered, chest torn, eyes wide with shock before the dust swallowed him whole. Evelyn gasped behind the window, her body rigid against the glass. Glay froze. He had not expected this. He thought his name, his money, his paper would shield him. But Jonas Kane wasn't a man who bowed to paper. He was a man who bowed only to what was right. Jonas stepped closer, slow, steady. His boots dragged lines through the dust, his shadow long in the dying sun. Glay held his gloves still, his mouth dry, his confidence shattered. You listen to me, and listen good, Jonas said, his voice low, carrying across the yard like a warning carved into stone. If I see your boots on this dirt again, I won't be aiming to scare. I'll be digging your grave right where you stand. For a moment, no one moved. The desert held its breath. Then Glay backed away. No words, no defiance left. Only the fear of a man who realized the weight of another's conviction. He stumbled to his horse, swung clumsy into the saddle, and yanked the reins. The two bodies on the ground stayed where they lay. Glay didn't look back. His tail was tucked, his pride bleeding in the dirt behind him. Jonas didn't chase him. He didn't need to. Some men you kill with bullets. Some you kill with the memory of fear. When the dust of their departure finally settled, Jonas lowered the rifle, his arms heavy, his chest heaving slow. The ranch was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This silence was... The tack room door opened. Evelyn stepped out, the coat still hanging from her shoulders, her hair wild from restless hours. She stood in the yard, not shaking now, not hiding. Her eyes locked on Jonas, not in fear, not in disbelief, but in something new, something closer to freedom. For a long while, neither spoke. The desert stretched endless around them. The horizon stained red, as if the sky itself carried their battle. Jonas leaned the rifle against the porch rail. Evelyn's gaze lingered on it, then shifted back to him. She didn't smile, not yet. But the weight on her shoulders seemed lighter. Inside, supper grew cold. The bread sat untouched. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that for the first time since her world had been torn apart, Evelyn felt the smallest spark of safety. And Jonas, who had lived years in silence, felt something stir in his chest that he had buried long ago. The West was a cruel land, built on debts and broken promises. But tonight, beneath a burning sky, one promise had been kept. And in that fragile space between dusk and night, Evelyn stood in the dirt, her face lifted to the fading light, and breathed not like prey, not like property, but like someone who belonged to herself again. The desert held its breath long after the riders were gone. Dust hung low, refusing to settle, as if the earth itself was unsure whether the fight had truly ended. Jonas stood still in the yard, rifle resting against the porch rail, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the empty trail. Evelyn watched him from just beyond the door, her bare feet rooted in the dirt. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't trembling. That night, the ranch was quiet. Too quiet. The dogs circled close, ears pricked, but no more hooves thundered across the land. Jonas sat at the table, bread untouched, his hand resting near the rifle stock, as though sleep was a luxury he no longer trusted. Evelyn lay in the tack room, staring at the roof beams, her body aching but her mind sharper than ever. She thought of her father, of dice rolling across a table, of whiskey-stained papers, of a signature that had sold her future. She thought of Glay's eyes, the weight of his grip, The way he had looked at her, not as a woman, but as a debt to be collected. And she thought of Jonas, his silence, his refusal to step aside, the way he had drawn a line no law could erase. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe she might not be alone in this fight. Days passed. No riders came. The land returned to its rhythm. Wind rolling through dry grass, chickens scratching near the coop, the sun rising without apology. Evelyn learned to use the hammer without dropping it. She helped Jonas mend fences, carry water, feed the horses. Each task left her sore, but alive in a way she hadn't felt in months. Then, one morning, she didn't come out for breakfast. Jonas knocked gently on the tack room door, his voice low. "Food's on the table." No answer. He waited, then pushed the door open. Evelyn sat on the edge of the cot, hands pressed hard against her stomach. Her face pale. Her eyes distant. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But the silence between them said more than words ever could. Jonas stepped inside, heavy boots soft on the floorboards. "What is it?" Her gaze lifted to his, haunted but steady. I think I'm carrying his child." The words hit the air like a bullet. Jonas froze. For a long moment, the only sound was the kettle hissing in the main room. Evelyn braced herself for what always came: judgment, rejection, shame. But Jonas didn't speak in anger. He didn't curse or turn away. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees, hands rubbing together as though he were weighing the weight of the world. Finally, he spoke. "You let it live." Her eyes widened. "Even if it's his? Even then?" Jonas nodded once, slow but certain. "Even then. That baby don't carry his sin, only yours. Only what you give it." The strength in his voice cracked something inside her. The wall she had built to keep herself from breaking crumbled at last. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent but fierce, as she leaned into his chest. Jonas wrapped his arms around her, not as a man claiming, not as a savior, but as someone holding on to what the world had thrown away. From that day forward, Evelyn didn't hide in the tack room. She walked beside Jonas into town. He sat with her in church, the old rifle leaning by his boot as though daring anyone to whisper too loud. He bought baby blankets in the same store where Glay had once strutted in, puffed up with power. Folks whispered. Of course they did. In a town where gossip traveled faster than the wind, silence was never an option. But Jonas didn't care. And slowly, neither did Evelyn. Still, nights weren't easy. Some dreams don't die quick. She woke sometimes to the sound of her own breath caught in her throat, her hands clutching at her belly as if to protect what hadn't yet come. Jonas would sit beside her in the dark, saying nothing, just letting her know she wasn't alone. But danger doesn't vanish with whispers. Men like Glay didn't forget. They licked their wounds, counted their losses, and plotted in shadows. Evelyn knew it. Jonas knew it. The quiet days were fragile, like glass ready to shatter. And yet within that fragile glass, there was light. Evelyn smiled now, not often, but when she did, it was real. Her hands didn't tremble when she picked up the hammer. She didn't flinch when she looked out across the desert. Jonas saw it too. He had been a man who once believed his life ended with silence, with fences and chickens and dust. But this girl, broken and unbroken all at once, had given him something back he didn't know he'd lost. A reason to stand. A reason to fight again. Not for war, not for glory, but for life itself. One evening, as the sun dropped low, Evelyn placed his coat back on the hook. She no longer needed it to shield her. She walked to the porch where Jonas sat, his rifle leaning nearby, the air heavy with the smell of dust and dusk. She sat beside him, her hands folded over her stomach. "They'll come again, won't they?" she asked quietly. Jonas's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, they'll come." Evelyn took a deep breath, steady now. "Then we'll be ready." Jonas turned his head toward her, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself the smallest smile. The desert stretched endless before them, red and gold, cruel and beautiful. Somewhere out there, shadows gathered, but here, on this patch of dirt, under this sky, stood two people who refused to bow to shadows anymore. Now, let me ask you, could you do the same? Could you stand beside someone carrying the weight of another man's sin and call it a life worth protecting? Could you love what the world calls shame? Because Jonas did, and Evelyn, scarred but unbroken, chose to fight for tomorrow. If this story struck something inside you, don't keep it quiet. Hit that like button, tap subscribe, and share this tale with someone who needs to be reminded. The strongest men are the ones who protect what others throw away, and the bravest women are those who choose to begin again. The desert is not kind. It strips men down to bone and truth, leaving nothing to hide behind. Evelyn had been broken, sold, used as payment for a debt she never owed. Jonas had been silent, a man who chose solitude after a life of war and loss. Together, their paths collided not by choice, but by consequence, two lives thrown into the dirt by cruelty. And yet, somehow, they found a reason to stand. The West was filled with men like Glee, men who believed money or papers could excuse a rotten soul. But paper burns. Land fades. What endures is the weight of what we choose to protect. Jonas could have turned her away. He could have told himself it wasn't his fight. But the truth is, some fights choose you. And when that knock came soft against his door, Jonas made the choice that mattered. He opened it. Evelyn's journey did not erase her scars. She carried them, as she carried the child born from violence. But scars can speak louder than shame. They can become proof that survival is itself an act of defiance. And that child, innocent, undeserving of its father's sins, wasn't a curse. It was a chance to build something new from the ashes of pain. So, what's the lesson buried in the dust of this story? That being a man isn't about land or law, it's about choosing to protect when the world turns its back. That being a woman isn't about what was taken from you, it's about what you refuse to surrender. And that family, in the harshest lands, is not blood or paper. It's the bond forged when two broken souls decide they will not let each other be forgotten.